I am George, and I'm about to tell you about the moment that changed everything. Picture this. You're standing at your own family reunion, watching your son gather everyone for the annual photo, and when you step forward to join them, he looks you straight in the eye and says there's no space for you. The laughter that followed wasn't the worst part. It was realizing that to my own family, I had become invisible, disposable, a burden they tolerated rather than loved. That night, I made a decision that would shock them all, a decision that would teach them the true meaning of absence. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. My name is George Whitman. I'm 81 years old, and what I don't lack is stories. I was born in 1943 in a small farming town in Nebraska, back when children were expected to work the land before they could barely walk. I've lived through wars, recessions, the death of my beloved wife Martha, and the slow, painful realization that the son I raised with such care had grown into a man who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. The Whitman family reunion happened every third Saturday in July, a tradition I had started 40 years ago when Paul was just 8 years old. Back then, he would run to me with grass-stained knees and chocolate-smeared cheeks, begging me to push him higher on the old rope swing I had hung from the massive oak tree in my backyard. Martha would set out her famous potato salad and apple pie, and we'd gather around the picnic table as the sun painted golden streaks across the evening sky. Those were the days when family meant something, when being together was a choice made out of love rather than obligation. This year's reunion was held at Paul's sprawling house in the suburbs, a monument to his success as a corporate lawyer. The manicured lawn stretched endlessly, dotted with expensive outdoor furniture, and a pool that cost more than I made in my best year working at the grain elevator. I arrived early, as I always did, carrying Martha's old recipe box, and hoping someone might want to hear the stories behind the faded index cards. My granddaughter Sarah, now 22 and fresh out of college, gave me a quick hug before disappearing into the house with her phone pressed to her ear. My grandson Michael, Paul's boy from his second marriage, barely looked up from his video game. The afternoon dragged on with forced conversations and polite smiles. I found myself standing alone by the food table, watching as clusters of family members talked around me, rather than to me. Paul's wife Jennifer, his third wife if we're counting, discussed her latest yoga retreat with Martha's sister Helen. Paul himself was holding court by the pool, regaling his cousins with stories of his recent promotion and the new BMW he'd just purchased. I had raised this man, changed his diapers, taught him to throw a baseball, walked into school every day until he was old enough to go alone. Yet here I stood feeling like a stranger in my own family. When the sun began to set and the citronella candles were lit, Paul clapped his hands together and called for attention. "All right, everyone, time for the annual Whitman family photo," he announced, his voice carrying the authority he'd perfected in courtrooms. "Let's gather by the oak tree, and let's make this one count." I watched as family members began to arrange themselves in the familiar formation. The adults in the back row, children in front, everyone finding their traditional spots with the ease of long practice. I had always stood in the center back row, right behind Martha when she was alive, and alone in that spot for the 5 years since her passing. It was my place, earned through decades of being the family patriarch, the one who had kept these traditions alive even when it would have been easier to let them fade. As I began to walk toward my usual position, Paul held up his hand like a traffic cop. "Whoa there, Dad," he said with that smile he used when he thought he was being clever. "I think we've got enough people back there already. Might be getting a little crowded." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept walking, assuming he was joking. Paul had always had a dry sense of humor, sometimes bordering on cruel, but surely he wouldn't exclude me from the family photo. Surely his words were just poorly chosen banter before he made room for me in the picture that would hang in his living room for the next year. "No, seriously, Dad," Paul continued, and I could hear the edge in his voice now, the impatience he usually reserved for opposing counsel. "We've got a good composition here. Maybe you could take the picture instead? You always were good with that old camera of yours." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, though it probably was only a few seconds. I could feel every eye in the family turning toward me, waiting to see how I would react to being asked to step aside, to become the photographer rather than a participant in my own family's portrait. Some faces showed embarrassment, others looked down at the ground, but a few, including Paul's wife Jennifer, actually smiled as if they found the situation amusing. "Come on, Paul," Helen finally said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your father should be in the picture. We can make room." "Aunt Helen, trust me, I know what I'm doing," Paul replied, pulling out his phone to check something. "Dad's camera skills are legendary. Remember those vacation photos from when I was a kid? He has an eye for this stuff." That's when it happened. That's when my grandson Michael, Paul's 17-year-old son, let out a laugh that cut through the evening air like a knife. "Yeah, Grandpa can be the photographer," he said with teenage cruelty. "There's really not enough space anyway." The laughter that followed wasn't loud or long, but it might as well have been a roaring crowd. Paul chuckled. Jennifer covered her mouth to hide her grin, and even some of my own nephews seemed to find humor in the situation. The sound of that laughter, directed at me, excluding me, would replay in my mind for weeks to come. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding Martha's recipe box in my weathered hands, watching as my family arranged themselves for a photo that would commemorate this gathering without me in it. 40 years of hosting these reunions, 40 years of maintaining family connections, of sending birthday cards and Christmas gifts, of being the one person everyone could count on to remember anniversaries and graduations, and now I was being asked to step behind the camera instead of standing proudly with the people I loved most in the world. "It's all right," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I can take the picture." I accepted Paul's expensive digital camera, its weight unfamiliar in hands more accustomed to my old film camera from the 1970s. Through the viewfinder, I watched as my family smiled and posed, their faces bright and happy in the golden hour light. Paul had his arms around Jennifer and Michael. Sarah stood next to her cousins, finally off her phone for the first time all day. Helen and her children filled out the back row where I should have been standing. "Perfect," Paul said after I had taken several shots from different angles. "Thanks, Dad. You really do have the touch." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People began to leave as the mosquitoes came out and the temperature dropped. I helped clean up, as I always did, carrying plates and folding chairs while conversations continued around me as if I wasn't there. When it came time for me to leave, Paul walked me to my old pickup truck, the same one I'd been driving for 15 years. "Good reunion this year," he said, checking his phone again. "Thanks for coming, Dad." "Thank you for having me," I replied, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. "Drive safe," Paul added, already turning back toward his house. "We'll see you next year." As I drove home through the dark country roads, Martha's recipe box sitting on the passenger seat beside me, I couldn't shake the image of that family photo. In my mind, I could see exactly what it would look like. A beautiful, complete-seeming picture of the Whitman family, with one glaring absence. Me. The man who had started this tradition, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for Paul's college education, who had given up his own dreams to ensure his family had everything they needed. My house felt impossibly quiet when I walked through the front door. The walls were covered with decades of family photos, including 40 years of reunion pictures. In every single one, Martha and I stood together in the center, surrounded by the family we had built and nurtured. In the photos after Martha's death, I stood alone in that center position, but I was there, visible, included, valued. That night, I sat in Martha's old rocking chair on the front porch, the same chair where she used to shell peas and watch thunderstorms roll across the Nebraska plains. I thought about the look on Paul's face when he told me there wasn't enough room in the photo. Not embarrassed, not apologetic, just matter-of-fact, as if my exclusion was the most natural thing in the world. I thought about Michael's laugh, the casual cruelty of a teenager who had learned from his father that some people matter less than others. I thought about Jennifer's smirk, the satisfaction of a woman who had always seen me as competition for Paul's attention and resources. I thought about all the family members who had said nothing, who had watched me be humiliated and chosen silence over speaking up. But mostly, I thought about Martha. She'd been gone for 5 years now, taken by cancer that consumed her slowly and painfully. In her final weeks, when the morphine made her drift in and out of consciousness, she had made me promise to keep the family together. "Don't let them forget what family means, George," she had whispered with her last clear words. "Promise me you'll keep them close." I had kept that promise for 5 years, organizing reunions, sending cards, making phone calls, driving hours to attend graduations and birthdays and baptisms. I had been the glue that held the Whitman family together, the keeper of traditions and memories and connections. And yesterday, they had made it clear that my efforts were no longer welcome, that I had become an inconvenience rather than a cornerstone. The decision came to me sometime around 3 in the morning, as I sat in that rocking chair watching the stars fade into dawn. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, if they wanted to take family photos without me, then I would give them exactly what they seemed to want. I would disappear. I had been thinking about leaving Nebraska for years, ever since Martha died, and the house became too big and too quiet. I had always talked about retiring to the coast, maybe somewhere in Oregon or Northern California, where I could watch the ocean and feel small in a way that was peaceful rather than painful. Martha and I had dreamed of buying a little cottage by the sea, spending our golden years collecting shells and watching sunsets over water instead of wheat fields. The morning after the reunion, I began to pack. I started with the essentials: clothes, medications, important documents, Martha's wedding ring, which I still wore on a chain around my neck. Then I moved on to the sentimental items: photo albums, Martha's recipe box, the quilt her mother had made for our wedding, the wooden clock I had built in my workshop 40 years ago. I didn't take much furniture, just a few pieces that held special meaning. The kitchen table where Martha and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years. The bookshelf I had built to hold her romance novels and my collection of war histories. Martha's rocking chair, of course, the one where she had rocked Paul to sleep when he was a baby and where I had held her hand during her final days. The hardest part was deciding what to do with the photos. Decades of family pictures covered every surface of the house: birthdays, holidays, vacations, school plays, graduations, weddings. Pictures of Paul as a gap-toothed little boy, proud as punch in his Little League uniform. Pictures of Michael taking his first steps in this very living room. Pictures of Sarah in her prom dress, twirling in front of the fireplace. In the end, I took only the photos that included Martha. The family pictures could stay with the family that no longer wanted me in them. Let Paul deal with sorting through 40 years of memories when he eventually came to clean out the house. Let him explain to his children why Grandpa wasn't in any of the recent pictures, why the family suddenly got smaller instead of growing larger with time. I called my bank and arranged to have my accounts transferred to a new branch. I called the post office and set up mail forwarding. I called the few friends I had left in town, men my age who understood what it meant to be forgotten by the children you raised. Most of them envied my courage to start over, to choose solitude over rejection. The only person I told about my plans was Helen, Martha's younger sister. She had always been kind to me, even after Martha died, sending me casseroles and calling to check on me during the long winter months. I knew she would worry if I simply vanished, and I also knew I could trust her to keep my secret until I was ready to reveal my new life. "I understand," Helen said when I called her 3 days after the reunion. "Paul was wrong to treat you that way. We all saw it." "Then why didn't anyone say anything?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Helen was quiet for a long moment. "Because it's easier to pretend we didn't see it than to confront it," she admitted. "Because Paul has money and influence, and most of us need his help with one thing or another. Because family dynamics are complicated, and sometimes good people do nothing when they should do something." Her honesty was both painful and refreshing. At least one person in my family was willing to acknowledge what had happened, instead of pretending it was normal or acceptable. "Where will you go?" Helen asked. "Somewhere I can watch the ocean," I replied. "Somewhere I can be anonymous until I decide whether I want to be found. I had researched coastal towns online, looking for places with affordable housing and mild climates. I settled on Mendocino, California, a small town perched on bluffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was far enough from Nebraska to feel like a different world, but not so far that I couldn't drive there in a few days. The town had a library, a small grocery store, a diner, and several art galleries. It seemed like the kind of place where an old man could blend in, where neighbors minded their own business, but weren't unfriendly. I found a furnished cottage for rent through an online listing, a one-bedroom place with a deck overlooking the ocean. The rent was more than I was used to paying, but my needs were simple now, and I had been saving money for years with nowhere to spend it. The landlord, a woman named Carol who lived in San Francisco, was happy to have a quiet, older tenant who could sign a year-long lease. The drive to California took me 4 days, with overnight stops in motels along the way. I had never been west of Colorado before, and I found myself amazed by the changing landscape. The endless flatness of Kansas giving way to the mountains of Colorado, then the deserts of Utah and Nevada, and finally the rolling hills of Northern California. Each mile took me further from everything I had ever known, but instead of feeling scared or homesick, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. The cottage in Mendocino was everything the photos had promised. Small but comfortable, with large windows facing the ocean and a deck where I could sit and watch the waves crash against the rocky coastline below. The sound of the ocean was constant but not overwhelming, a rhythmic background that seemed to wash away the accumulated stress and disappointment of the past 5 years. I spent my first week in California doing nothing but watching the water and learning the rhythms of my new surroundings. I discovered that fog rolled in from the ocean every evening around 6 o'clock, shrouding the town in a cool, mysterious blanket that lifted again by mid-morning. I learned that the local diner served excellent coffee and homemade pie, and that the librarian, a woman named Margaret who was probably in her 60s, was always happy to recommend books about local history and nature. For the first time since Martha died, I felt like myself again. Not Paul's father, not Michael's grandfather, not the old man who needed to be managed and accommodated and occasionally humored. Just George Whitman, a man with his own thoughts and desires and daily routines. I established new habits quickly. Morning coffee on the deck, watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of pink and gold. A walk into town for groceries and library books, stopping to chat with shopkeepers who were friendly without being intrusive. Afternoons spent reading or working on a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table. Evenings on the deck again, this time with a glass of wine and whatever simple dinner I had prepared for myself. The isolation that might have felt lonely in Nebraska felt peaceful here. In my old life, being alone meant being forgotten, abandoned, left behind. Here, being alone was a choice, a luxury, a chance to rediscover who I was without the constant weight of family expectations and disappointments. 3 weeks into my new life, Paul called my old house. When there was no answer, he called my cell phone, which I had deliberately left behind in Nebraska. When that went straight to voicemail, he called Helen. "Where's Dad?" he asked, according to Helen, who called me the next day to report on the conversation. "I've been trying to reach him for days." "Why do you need to reach him?" Helen had asked. "I don't need to reach him," Paul replied, apparently irritated by the question. "I just want to make sure he's okay. It's not like him to not answer his phone." Helen told me she had been tempted to point out that it wasn't like Paul to call more than once a month, but she had held her tongue. Instead, she suggested that maybe I was busy, maybe I was visiting friends, maybe I was taking some time for myself. Time for himself? Paul had laughed. "Dad doesn't go anywhere. He's lived in the same house for 40 years. The conversation had ended with Paul saying he would drive over to check on me if he didn't hear from me by the weekend. Helen warned me that I probably had 3 days before Paul discovered the house was empty and launched a full-scale search. I wasn't ready to be found. I wasn't ready to explain myself or defend my decision or listen to Paul tell me how worried everyone had been. I wasn't ready to be talked into coming home to a life where I was tolerated, rather than treasured. Instead, I did something I had never done before. I hired a lawyer. Margaret at the library had recommended a local attorney named David Chen, a young man who specialized in family law and elder rights. I explained my situation to him, emphasizing that I was not missing or in danger or suffering from any form of dementia or coercion. I was simply an 81-year-old man who had chosen to relocate and didn't want to be harassed by family members who suddenly cared about my well-being. David helped me draft a letter that could be sent to Paul if necessary, a legal document that made clear I was competent, safe, and acting of my own free will. He also helped me understand my rights as an adult to live where I chose and associate with whom I chose, regardless of my age or my family's opinions about my decisions. Family dynamics can be complicated, David said, echoing Helen's words from weeks earlier. Sometimes the people who love us most think they know what's best for us, even when they're wrong. I appreciated his diplomatic way of describing people who had made it clear they didn't love me at all, at least not enough to include me in a simple family photograph. True to Helen's prediction, Paul discovered my empty house that weekend. According to Helen, who had become my unofficial correspondent, Paul had used his spare key to let himself in, expecting to find me ill or injured. Instead, he found a house that was clearly abandoned, but not ransacked, with obvious signs that someone had packed deliberately and carefully. The missing furniture had been his first clue that this wasn't a medical emergency or a burglary. The missing photo albums had been the second clue. By the time he noticed that Martha's rocking chair was gone, Paul had apparently realized that his father hadn't been kidnapped or hospitalized. He had simply left. Paul's first reaction, according to Helen, had been anger. How dare I worry the family like this? How irresponsible was it to disappear without telling anyone where I was going? What if there was an emergency and they needed to reach me? His second reaction had been to call the police, who politely explained that adults have the right to move without notifying their families, and that there was no evidence of foul play or diminished capacity. They suggested he hire a private investigator if he was truly concerned about my well-being. His third reaction had been to call Helen and demand that she tell him where I was. I don't know where he is, Helen had lied smoothly. But if I did know, I wouldn't tell you unless George wanted me to. What's that supposed to mean? Paul had snapped. It means your father is a grown man who can make his own decisions about where he wants to live and who he wants to see, Helen replied. And maybe if you thought about why he might have wanted to leave, you'd understand that this is nobody's fault but your own. That conversation had ended with Paul hanging up on his aunt, but Helen said she didn't regret her words. Someone needed to say it, she told me during our weekly phone call. Someone needed to point out that you don't treat people badly and then act surprised when they don't want to be around you anymore. Paul hired a private investigator, a fact I learned when David Chen called to tell me that someone had been asking questions about me in Mendocino. The investigator had been discreet and professional, simply confirming that I was living in the area and appeared to be in good health. When the man had asked local shopkeepers about my daily routine or whether I seemed confused or vulnerable, he had been told that I seemed perfectly normal and that people in Mendocino respected each other's privacy. Your son now knows where you are, David informed me. The question is, what you want to do about that information. I had been living in California for 2 months by then, long enough to establish routines and friendships, long enough to feel like this was home rather than a hiding place. I had joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at the local animal shelter, and begun taking watercolor classes at the community center. For the first time in years, I had activities that were mine, relationships that existed independent of my role as someone's father or grandfather. I want to send a letter, I decided. I want Paul to understand that this isn't a kidnapping or a mental breakdown. I want him to know that I chose this life because I was tired of being invisible in the life I had before. David mailed the letter, which read in part, I am writing to inform you that I am safe, healthy, and living independently in California. My decision to relocate was made freely and with full mental capacity. I am not missing, I am not in danger, and I do not wish to be contacted by private investigators or other representatives acting on behalf of my family. If you wish to communicate with me directly, you may write to me through my attorney, whose contact information is included below. Any attempts to locate my specific address or to visit me uninvited will be considered harassment and may result in legal action. The letter was formal and cold, nothing like the warm, rambling letters I had written to Paul throughout his childhood when he was away at summer camp or college. But our relationship had become formal and cold, and I saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Paul's response came 3 weeks later, not through David's office, but through Helen, who called me on a Tuesday evening, sounding exhausted. "Paul wants me to talk to you," she said without preamble. "He wants me to convince you to come home." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I wasn't his messenger service," Helen replied. "But he's persistent, George. He's called me every day for a week. He's driving me crazy." "What does he want to say that he can't put in a letter?" Helen sighed. "He wants to apologize. He says he didn't realize how the photo thing looked, that he was just trying to get a good picture and didn't think about how it would make you feel. He says everyone misses you and wants you to come home." The words should have felt like vindication, like the acknowledgement I had been waiting for. Instead, they felt hollow and calculated, like something Paul might say in court when he needed to convince a jury of his client's remorse. "He didn't realize how it looked?" I repeated. "Helen, he excluded his 81-year-old father from the family photo and then laughed about it. How exactly did he think it looked?" "I don't know, George. I'm just telling you what he said." "And what about everyone else?" "Michael, who laughed at his grandfather. Jennifer, who smirked while her stepfather-in-law was humiliated. Sarah, who couldn't be bothered to look up from her phone long enough to see what was happening. Do they all miss me too?" Helen was quiet for a long moment. "Paul says they do." "Paul says a lot of things." We talked for another hour, with Helen trying to bridge a gap that felt unbridgeable. She told me about family members who were asking about me, about Michael starting his senior year of high school, about Sarah's new job in marketing. She told me that Paul had framed the family photo from the reunion and hung it in his living room, and that people who visited always asked where I was. "What does he tell them?" I asked. "He says you weren't feeling well that day." Even in my absence, Paul was rewriting history, creating a narrative that protected his reputation while diminishing mine. I wasn't the father who had been cruelly excluded from a family photo. I was the old man who hadn't been feeling well, the burden who couldn't keep up with family activities. "Tell Paul that I appreciate his apology," I said finally. "And tell him that I'm happy in California, happier than I've been in years. Tell him that if he truly misses me, he'll respect my decision to stay here and live my own life." "What if he wants to visit you?" Helen asked. "Then he can write me a letter through my attorney and ask permission, like any other stranger who wants to invade my privacy." The conversation ended with Helen promising to relay my message, though she made it clear she thought I was being stubborn and unforgiving. Maybe I was. Maybe 40 years of putting family first, of swallowing my pride and making excuses for Paul's selfishness, had used up my capacity for forgiveness. Maybe some betrayals were too fundamental to overlook, too painful to forget. Christmas came and went without any contact from Nebraska. I spent the holiday volunteering at the animal shelter, helping to care for abandoned pets who, like me, had been discarded by the people who were supposed to love them. On New Year's Eve, I sat on my deck with a glass of champagne, watching fireworks explode over the ocean and feeling grateful for the solitude I had chosen over the loneliness I had endured. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. I started a small garden on the sunny side of the cottage, growing vegetables I had never tried before, artichokes and fennel and unusual varieties of tomatoes that thrived in the coastal climate. I joined a hiking group for seniors and discovered muscles I hadn't used in decades as we explored trails that wound through redwood forests and along cliff tops. Most importantly, I started writing. I had always been a reader, but I had never considered myself a writer until Margaret at the library suggested I contribute to the town's oral history project. What started as a few pages about growing up during World War II became a memoir about farming in Nebraska, about raising a family during the social upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, about learning to live again after losing the love of your life. The writing gave me perspective on my own story, helped me understand how I had arrived at this point in my life. I wrote about Martha's death and the crushing loneliness that followed. I wrote about watching Paul become successful and distant, more interested in impressing strangers than maintaining relationships with family. I wrote about the grandchildren who saw me as an obligation rather than an opportunity. Teenagers too busy with their own lives to learn the stories that would die with me. And I wrote about the family photo, about the moment when I realized that I had become invisible to the people I loved most. I wrote about the laughter that followed my exclusion, about the drive home through dark country roads, about the decision to choose dignity over desperation. The memoir grew to over 200 pages. A lifetime of memories and observations and hard-won wisdom. Margaret encouraged me to submit it to small presses that specialized in regional stories and memoirs by older writers. To my surprise, a publisher in San Francisco expressed interest in the book, particularly in the sections about family dynamics and aging in America. Your story resonates with a lot of people, the editor told me during our first phone conversation. There's a whole generation of older Americans who feel invisible, who feel like their families see them as burdens rather than blessings. Your voice is authentic, and your perspective is valuable. The book was published 8 months after I arrived in California, almost exactly a year after the family reunion that had changed everything. Invisible at 81, a father's journey to reclaim his life. Appeared in bookstores throughout Northern California and was reviewed favorably in several regional publications. Margaret organized a book signing at the Mendocino Library, and I was amazed when more than 50 people showed up to hear me read excerpts and answer questions about the writing process. Many of them were older adults who shared their own stories of family disappointment and reinvention. Some were younger people who said the book had helped them understand their own aging parents better. One woman, probably in her 50s, approached me after the formal presentation was over. "I read your book because my father-in-law moved away last year after my husband excluded him from our anniversary party," she said quietly. "I didn't understand why he was so hurt at the time, but your book helped me see it from his perspective. I've been trying to convince my husband to reach out and apologize, but he says his father is being dramatic and oversensitive. What do you think?" I asked. "I think your husband sounds a lot like my son," I replied. "I think some people don't understand that respect and inclusion aren't luxuries for older people. They're necessities. And I think it's never too late to apologize if the apology is genuine." The woman bought 3 copies of the book, 1 for herself, and 2 for friends who were dealing with similar family situations. As I signed her books, she told me that she hoped her father-in-law was as happy in his new life as I seemed to be in mine. Word of the book eventually made its way back to Nebraska, carried by someone who had seen the review in a Sacramento newspaper or had heard about it through the complex network of connections that link small towns across the country. Helen called me on a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, almost 18 months after I had left home. "Paul knows about your book," she said without preamble. "I assumed he would find out eventually. He's not happy about it. I didn't write it to make him happy." Helen laughed, a sound that held equal parts admiration and exasperation. "He wants to know if you used his real name." "I changed all the names except mine and Martha's. I wanted to protect people's privacy, even people who didn't protect my dignity." "He's talking about suing you." "For what? Telling the truth about my own life?" "He says you portrayed him unfairly, made him look like a bad son." "I wrote about my experience, Helen. If that makes him look bad, maybe he should examine his behavior instead of threatening legal action." We talked for another hour about the book, about my life in California, about the family members who were asking about me. Helen told me that Michael had graduated from high school and was starting college in the fall. Sarah had gotten engaged to a young man she met at work. Paul's law firm had expanded to include 3 new partners. Life in Nebraska was continuing without me, just as I had known it would. The family gatherings were still happening. The traditions were still being maintained. The photos were still being taken. My absence had been noted, but not mourned. Acknowledged, but not addressed. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Helen asked, as our conversation was winding down. I looked out my window at the ocean, where the evening fog was beginning to roll in from the horizon. A pod of whales had been spotted offshore that morning, and several boats were still anchored in the bay, their passengers hoping to catch a glimpse of the massive creatures. In a few minutes, I would walk down to the shore and join the other whale watchers, people who had become friends over the months I had lived here. "No," I said honestly, "I don't regret leaving. I regret that I waited so long to do it." The success of the book led to speaking engagements at libraries and community centers throughout Northern California. I found myself in the unexpected position of being an advocate for older adults who felt marginalized by their families, a voice for people who had been written off as burdens or inconveniences. The speaking fees weren't large, but they supplemented my retirement income and gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. More importantly, the book opened conversations that had been closed for too long. I received letters from readers across the country, people who shared their own stories of family rejection and personal reinvention. Some were older adults like myself, who had chosen independence over invisibility. Others were middle-aged children who had read my book and recognized their own behavior in Paul's actions. One letter particularly moved me, from a woman in Ohio whose father had stopped attending family gatherings after being repeatedly ignored and marginalized by his adult children. "I never realized how invisible we were making him feel until I read your book," she wrote. "I called him yesterday for the first time in 6 months, and we talked for 2 hours. Thank you for helping me understand that being old doesn't mean being irrelevant." Another letter came from a man in his 70s who had been considering moving to assisted living because his family kept suggesting he was becoming too much trouble to manage independently. "Your book gave me the courage to tell them that I'm not ready to give up my autonomy just because I'm getting older," he wrote. "If you can start over at 81, I can certainly stay put at 73. The letters reminded me that my story was not unique, that thousands of older Americans were struggling with similar feelings of invisibility and disposability. The demographic shifts in the country meant that more families were dealing with aging parents and grandparents. But many younger adults seemed unprepared for the emotional complexities of these relationships. They knew how to manage medical appointments and financial affairs, but they didn't know how to preserve dignity and maintain respect. 2 years after leaving Nebraska, I received an unexpected call from David Chen, my attorney. The young woman had contacted his office, claiming to be my granddaughter and asking for permission to visit me. She had provided enough personal information to verify her identity. Sarah, Paul's daughter, now 24 and living in Denver. "She says she's been trying to reach you for months," David explained. "She read your book and wants to apologize for her behavior at the reunion. She's asking if she can drive up from Denver to see you." I was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Sarah had been one of the most distant family members at that final reunion, more interested in her phone than in participating in family conversations. She had watched her father exclude me from the photo without saying a word, had laughed along with her cousin Michael's cruel joke. "What exactly did she say?" I asked. "She said she was young and selfish and didn't understand how her actions affected other people. She said reading your book made her realize that she had been part of something that hurt you deeply, and she wants a chance to make it right." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I would relay her message and that any response would come through me. I also told her that you value your privacy and that any visit would need to be on your terms." I spent 3 days thinking about Sarah's request. Part of me was curious about what she wanted to say, whether her apology would be genuine or just another attempt to assuage family guilt. Part of me was protective of the peace I had built in California, reluctant to open old wounds or invite drama into my carefully constructed new life. But there was also a part of me that remembered the little girl Sarah had been, the toddler who used to fall asleep in my lap during family gatherings, the elementary school student who had begged me to read her the same bedtime story over and over during visits to my house. Perhaps there was something worth salvaging in our relationship. Something that had been buried under years of teenage self-absorption and family dysfunction. I called David and told him that Sarah could visit, but only under specific conditions. She could come for one afternoon. She could not bring anyone else with her, and she could not share my address with other family members without my explicit permission. If she wanted to stay in touch after the visit, any future contact would need to be arranged through David's office. Sarah arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, driving a small Honda that looked much more modest than the luxury vehicles her father preferred. She knocked on my door tentatively, as if she wasn't sure she was at the right place, and when I opened it, I was struck by how much she had changed since I had seen her last. The sullen teenager with the perpetually attached phone had been replaced by a young woman who looked me directly in the eye and spoke with genuine emotion in her voice. She was thinner than I remembered, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that she had obviously picked from someone's garden rather than bought from a florist. "Hi, Grandpa George," she said, and her voice broke slightly on my name. "Thank you for letting me come." I invited her in and offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully. We sat in my small living room, surrounded by the books and art I had collected during my time in California, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. The ocean was unusually calm that day, its gentle sounds drifting through the open windows, along with the scent of salt air and wild roses. "I read your book," Sarah finally said, clutching her coffee mug with both hands. "I read it 3 times, actually. I kept hoping that maybe I had misunderstood what happened at the reunion, that maybe it wasn't as bad as you made it sound. But it was worse, wasn't it?" "It was bad enough," I replied, studying her face for signs of manipulation or false sincerity. What I saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like shame. "I was horrible." "To you?" she continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Not just at the reunion, but for years before that. I was so wrapped up in my own life, my own problems, that I never even thought about how lonely you must have been after Grandma Martha died. I never asked about your day or your health or whether you needed anything. I just showed up at family events, barely acknowledged you, and then left as soon as I could." She was crying openly now, not the dramatic tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the quiet, steady tears of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth about themselves. "When Dad told everyone there wasn't room for you in the photo, I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. But I didn't, because it was easier to go along with Dad than to risk making him angry. And when Michael laughed, I should have told him to shut up. But I didn't do that either, because I was a coward." I handed her a tissue from the box on the side table, remembering countless other times I had comforted crying grandchildren, though usually their tears had been caused by scraped knees or broken toys rather than moral reckonings. "Why are you here, Sarah?" I asked gently. "What do you want from me?" "I want to apologize," she said immediately. "I want you to know that I understand what we did to you was wrong, and I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not because Dad sent me, or because the family wants you to come back, but because I finally grew up enough to realize that you deserved better from all of us." "Your father didn't send you?" Sarah shook her head emphatically. "Dad doesn't even know I'm here. He'd probably be furious that he found out. He still thinks you're being dramatic, and that you'll eventually come home when you get tired of proving your point. And what do you think? And what do you think? I think you found something here that you never had with us. I think you're happier without us than you ever were with us, and I think that says something terrible about the kind of family we became." We talked for 4 hours that afternoon, longer than Sarah and I had talked in the previous 10 years combined. She told me about her job at a nonprofit organization that worked with homeless veterans, about the boyfriend she was planning to marry, about the therapy she had started after reading my book, and realizing how much damage had been done by her family's dysfunction. "I used to think our family was normal," she said as the afternoon sun began to slant through my windows. "All families have problems, right? All teenagers are self-absorbed, and all parents are imperfect. But reading your book made me realize that there's a difference between normal family problems and systematic disrespect. We didn't just have problems, Grandpa George. We were cruel. I appreciated her honesty, even though it was painful to hear my own family described in such harsh terms. But cruelty was the right word for what had happened at that reunion, for the pattern of behavior that had led up to that moment and continued afterward. "What about your father?" I asked. "Has he read the book?" "He says he has, but I don't think he really understands it. He keeps talking about how you misrepresented what happened, how you made him look worse than he actually is. He can't seem to grasp that the problem wasn't how you portrayed him, it was how he actually behaved." "And Michael?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Michael is turning into Dad. Same arrogance, same inability to admit when he's wrong, same tendency to blame other people for his problems. He's in college now. And he talks about you like you're some crazy old man who ran away from home for attention." "Maybe I did run away for attention," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "No," Sarah said firmly. "You ran away for dignity. There's a difference." As the evening approached and it became time for Sarah to begin her drive back to Denver, she asked the question I had been expecting all afternoon. "Is there any chance you would consider coming back? Not to move back permanently, but just to visit, maybe for Christmas or for next year's reunion?" I had thought about this possibility many times over the past 2 years. Usually late at night when the cottage felt too quiet and the ocean seemed too vast. There were moments when I missed the familiar rhythms of life in Nebraska, the changing seasons and the wide skies, and the sense of rootedness that came from living in the same place for decades. But I also knew that returning, even for a visit, would inevitably involve compromises and accommodations that I was no longer willing to make. I would be expected to pretend that nothing had changed, to slip back into the role of grateful grandfather who was happy to accept whatever scraps of attention the family was willing to offer. "I don't think so, Sarah," I said gently. "I'm not the same person who left Nebraska 2 years ago, and I suspect the family isn't ready to accept the person I've become. What if things were different? What if Dad apologized, really apologized? What if we all committed to treating you better? Then I would be happy for all of you," I replied. "But I wouldn't come back. I've built a life here that I love, with people who value me for who I am, rather than tolerating me because I'm related to them. I'm not going to give that up for the possibility that your father might learn to treat me with respect." Sarah nodded sadly, but I could see that she understood. She had grown up enough to recognize that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. "Can I stay in touch with you?" she asked as I walked her to her car. "Not to pressure you about coming back, but just because I want to know how you're doing, because I want to be part of your life, even if it's a small part. You can write to me through my attorney," I said. "If you're serious about maintaining a relationship, if you're not just feeling guilty because you read my book, then we can see how it goes." Sarah hugged me goodbye, the first physical affection I had received from a family member in over 2 years. It felt strange and familiar at the same time, like hearing a song you used to love, but haven't listened to in a long time. "I love you, Grandpa George," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "I love you too, Sarah. I always have." After she drove away, I sat on my deck and watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and pink. The visit had been emotionally exhausting, but also oddly healing. It was good to know that at least one member of my family had been capable of growth and self-reflection, that not everyone was content to let our relationships remain frozen in patterns of disrespect and neglect. Sarah did continue to write to me, sending letters through David's office every few weeks. Her correspondence was thoughtful and genuine, full of details about her work and her upcoming wedding, and her ongoing efforts to understand and repair the damage that had been done to our family. She never pressured me to reconcile with other family members, never suggested that my absence was causing problems for anyone else. Through Sarah's letters, I learned that Paul had indeed been angry when he discovered that she had visited me. He had accused her of betraying the family, of encouraging my stubbornness, of making it harder for everyone to move on from what he continued to characterize as a minor misunderstanding that had been blown out of Gasha. Proportion. He still doesn't get it. Sarah wrote in one letter. He thinks this is all about pride and hurt feelings. He doesn't understand that you're not coming back because you're happy where you are, not because you're angry about where you were. Paul had also tried to use his legal connections to cause problems for me in California, contacting the local authorities to suggest that I might be suffering from dementia or depression and might need a welfare check. The sheriff who visited my cottage was professional but skeptical, clearly recognizing the difference between a concerned family member and someone trying to use the system to harass an estranged relative. Your son seems to think you're not capable of making your own decisions, the sheriff had said, after determining that I was obviously healthy and competent. But you seem pretty sharp to me. Are you here because you want to be here? I'm here because this is where I choose to live, I had replied. My son is having trouble accepting that his elderly father might have his own opinions about his own life. The sheriff had laughed and advised me to document any further harassment attempts, just in case Paul decided to escalate his efforts to force me to return to Nebraska. 3 years after leaving home, I published a second book. This one focused specifically on family relationships and aging. The Adult Child's Guide to Respecting Your Parents drew heavily on the letters I had received from readers of my first book, as well as my own experiences with family dysfunction and recovery. The second book was more successful than the first, receiving national attention and leading to speaking engagements across the country. I found myself on radio shows and podcasts discussing the challenges facing American families as the population aged and traditional support systems strained under changing social and economic pressures. The success of the books also brought unexpected financial security. Combined with my retirement savings and Social Security, the royalties and speaking fees allowed me to live comfortably without worrying about money for the first time since Martha's illness had drained our savings. I was able to buy the cottage I had been renting, to travel when I wanted to see new places, to donate generously to causes I cared about. More importantly, the books gave me a platform to advocate for older adults who were struggling with similar family issues. I testified before a state legislative committee about elder abuse and neglect, participated in research studies about family dynamics and aging, and consulted with social service agencies about best practices for protecting the dignity and autonomy of older clients. My speaking engagements took me to cities across the country, where I met thousands of people who had read my books and recognized their own families in my stories. Some were older adults who felt empowered to set boundaries with disrespectful children. Others were middle-aged adults who had never considered their parents' perspectives and were working to repair damaged relationships. One of the most memorable events was a conference in Chicago, where I was scheduled to speak about family communication and respect. In the green room before my presentation, I met another speaker, a family therapist named Dr. Linda Martinez, who specialized in intergenerational relationships. "Your books have been incredibly helpful in my practice," she told me. "I have so many clients who are dealing with exactly the kind of situation you describe. Adult children who think they know what's best for their parents, older adults who feel like they've become invisible in their own families." "It seems to be a widespread problem," I replied. I had no idea how common these experiences were until I started writing about my own situation. "The demographics are working against us," Dr. Martinez explained. "We have more older adults than ever before, living longer than ever before, but we also have smaller families and more geographic dispersion. Adult children are overwhelmed by caregiving responsibilities they're not prepared for, and older adults are caught between wanting independence and needing support." End quote. Our conversation continued throughout the conference, and Dr. Martinez invited me to collaborate on a research project she was developing about successful aging and family relationships. The project involved interviewing older adults who had made significant life changes after age 75, documenting their experiences and identifying factors that contributed to positive trauma outcomes. Working on the research project introduced me to dozens of people who had reinvented their lives in their later years. Some had moved across the country, like me. Others had gone back to school, started new careers, ended long marriages, or begun new relationships. All of them had faced criticism from family members who thought they were being impulsive or irresponsible. There's this assumption that, once you reach a certain age, you're supposed to stop growing and changing, explained Margaret, a 78-year-old woman who had divorced her husband of 55 years and moved to Sasha, Costa Rica. People think you should be content with whatever life you have, even if that life isn't making you happy anymore. The hardest part is dealing with your own children, added Robert, an 83-year-old man who had sold his house and started traveling the country in an RV. They want to protect you from making mistakes, but what they're really doing is protecting themselves from having to worry about you. It's easier for them if you stay put and stay predictable. The research project confirmed what I had suspected from my own experience and from the letters I received. Many older adults felt constrained by family expectations that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities or desires. Adult children, often acting from good intentions, were inadvertently limiting their parents' autonomy and contributing to feelings of invisibility and irrelevance. The project also identified factors that contributed to successful late-life transitions. People who thrived after making major changes tended to have strong social networks outside their families, financial resources that allowed for independence, good physical and mental health, and most importantly, a clear sense of their own values and priorities. You can't reinvent your life to please other people, Dr. Martinez concluded in our final research report. You have to be willing to disappoint family members who want you to stay the same, and you have to be prepared for the possibility that some relationships won't survive your transformation. 4 years after leaving Nebraska, I received a letter that wasn't from Sarah. The envelope was addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, but the return address was from my hometown. Inside was a short note from a woman named Patricia, whom I remembered as one of Paul's high school classmates. "Dear Mr. Whitman," the letter began. "I hope you remember me. I'm Pat Morrison now. But I was Patricia Collins when Paul and I were in school together. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that your son had a heart attack last week. He's in the hospital in Lincoln, and from what I hear, it was pretty serious. I know you and Paul have had some kind of falling out, and I don't know the details, but I thought you should know in case you want to reach out to him." The letter included the name of the hospital and Paul's room number, as well as Patricia's phone number in case I wanted more information. I read the letter 3 times, trying to process the flood of emotions it triggered. Concern for Paul's health, anger at being informed by a stranger rather than by family, guilt over feeling relieved that someone else had made the decision about whether to contact me. I called Patricia that evening, and she filled in the details that her letter had omitted. Paul had collapsed at his law office during a particularly stressful week of trials. The heart attack had been severe enough to require emergency surgery, and while he was expected to recover, his doctors were recommending significant lifestyle changes. "His wife called me because she didn't know how to reach you," Patricia explained. "She said Paul had forbidden anyone from contacting you, but she was scared and thought you should know. She asked me to write to you because she was afraid Paul would be angry if he found out she had reached out directly. How is he doing now?" "Better, from what I hear. He's conscious and talking, but he's going to be in the hospital for at least another week. The doctors want to monitor his heart and make sure there aren't any complications." I thanked Patricia for the information and promised to think about what, if anything, I wanted to do with it. After hanging up, I sat on my deck and watched the evening fog roll in from the ocean, trying to sort through my complicated feelings about Paul's medical crisis. Part of me wanted to drive to Nebraska immediately, to be present during a family emergency regardless of our estrangement. The father in me, the part that had stayed up all night when Paul had pneumonia as a child, that had paced hospital waiting rooms during his various childhood injuries and illnesses, felt compelled to be there for him now. But another part of me remembered the years of disrespect and dismissal that had led to my departure from Nebraska. Paul had made it clear that he didn't value my presence in his life, had literally excluded me from family photos, had hired investigators to track me down, not out of love, but out of a need to control the situation. His current medical crisis didn't erase the pattern of behavior that had driven me away. I spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, before finally calling David Chen and asking him to contact the hospital on my behalf. I wanted to know Paul's current condition and prognosis, and I wanted to send a message that I hoped for his full recovery, but I didn't want to create false expectations about reconciliation or my willingness to return to the family fold. David reported back that Paul was indeed recovering well from the surgery and was expected to be discharged within a few days. When David had identified himself as my attorney and explained that I was concerned about Paul's health, the nurse had asked if I wanted to be transferred to Paul's room. I told her you wanted information about his condition but weren't ready to speak with him directly, David said. She seemed to understand that there were family complications involved. Did she say anything else? She mentioned that there had been several requests for your contact information and that the family was hoping you would come to visit. I told her that any communication would need to go through this office. I sent flowers to Paul's hospital room with a card that read simply, "Wishing you a full and speedy recovery, George." It was a gesture that acknowledged our blood relationship without pretending that our emotional relationship had been repaired. The flowers apparently caused quite a stir in Paul's room, according to Sarah, who called David's office the next day asking for permission to speak with me. When David relayed her request, I agreed to take her call. "Dad is really shaken up," Sarah reported. "Not just from the heart attack, but from realizing how close he came to dying without ever making things right with you. He keeps saying he wants to apologize, that he wants to fix things between you." "What do you think?" I asked. "Do you believe he's genuinely changed, or is this just a response to facing his own mortality?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I think he's scared," she said finally. "I think the heart attack made him realize that life is short and that he's wasted a lot of time being proud and stubborn. But I also think he still doesn't really understand what he did wrong or why you left. He keeps talking about this like it's a misunderstanding that can be cleared up with a good conversation." End quote. "And you don't think it's that simple?" "I think Dad would need to do a lot of work on himself before he'd be ready for the kind of relationship you deserve. I think he'd need to really examine his behavior and his attitudes, not just apologize for the specific incident at the reunion. And honestly, I'm not sure he's capable of that kind of self-reflection." End quote. I appreciated Sarah's honesty, even though it confirmed my own suspicions about Paul's sudden desire for reconciliation. A near-death experience might motivate someone to reach out to estranged family members, but it didn't automatically create the emotional maturity necessary for healthy relationships. "What would you do if you were me?" I asked. "I would stay exactly where you are," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I would continue living the life you've built in California, surrounded by people who appreciate you and activities that fulfill you. I would resist the temptation to rush back to Nebraska just because Dad is sick, because that would send the message that your boundaries only matter when he's healthy." End quote. Her advice aligned with my own instincts, but it was reassuring to hear it from someone who understood both sides of the situation. Sarah had maintained relationships with both me and the rest of the family, giving her a unique perspective on the dynamics involved. Paul recovered from his heart attack and returned home after a week in the hospital. According to Sarah's reports, he had indeed been chastened by the experience and was making some of the lifestyle changes his doctors had recommended. He was exercising more, eating better, and trying to reduce the stress in his work life. But he was also still waiting for me to respond to his apparent willingness to reconcile, still expecting that his medical crisis would be sufficient to bring me home. When weeks passed without any direct communication from me, he began to express frustration and resentment that I was holding a grudge during his recovery period. "He's starting to get angry again," Sarah reported during one of our phone calls. "He's saying things like, 'I almost died, and he still won't forgive me,' as if your forgiveness is something he's entitled to just because he's been sick. Does he understand that this isn't about forgiveness?" I asked. "That I'm not staying away to punish him, but because I'm happy with the life I've built here?" "I don't think he can understand that," Sarah replied. "I think in his mind, the only reason you would choose to live away from family is if you're angry with family. The idea that you might have found something better doesn't compute for him." As Paul's health improved and his expectation of reconciliation went unfulfilled, the old patterns of behavior began to reassert themselves. He started making comments to other family members about my selfishness and stubbornness. He renewed his complaints about the books I had written, claiming that I was profiting from family dysfunction and embarrassing the Whitman name. Most disturbingly, according to Sarah, he had begun to refer to me as having abandoned the family during a medical crisis, a narrative that painted me as heartless and himself as the victim of my cruelty. Once again, Paul was rewriting history to protect his own reputation while casting me as the villain in our story. The attempted reconciliation that never materialized taught me an important lesson about the difference between regret and genuine change. Paul might have regretted the consequences of his behavior, might have wished things were different between us, but he hadn't developed the capacity for the kind of honest self-examination that would be necessary for a healthy relationship. 5 years after leaving Nebraska, I was thriving in ways I had never imagined possible. My books continued to sell well, providing both financial security and a platform for advocacy. My speaking engagements had evolved into workshops and seminars that helped families navigate the challenges of aging and intergenerational relationships. The research project with Dr. Martinez had led to additional collaborations and publications. Most importantly, I had built a rich social life in Mendocino. The book club at the library had become a close-knit group of friends who gathered weekly to discuss literature and share personal stories. The hiking group had introduced me to the spectacular natural beauty of Northern California, from the redwood forests to the rugged coastline. My volunteer work at the animal shelter had connected me with other animal lovers who shared my values and interests. I had also begun a romantic relationship with Carol, the woman who owned my cottage. She lived in San Francisco during the week but spent weekends in Mendocino, and over time, our landlord-tenant relationship had evolved into friendship and then into something deeper. Carol was 73, a retired art teacher who had been widowed for 8 years. Like me, she had children who lived far away and who were too busy with their own lives to provide much companionship. "We're not trying to replace what we had before," Carol said one evening as we sat on the deck watching the sunset. "We're not trying to recreate our marriages or fill the holes left by the people we've lost. We're just enjoying each other's company and seeing where it leads." Our relationship was comfortable and uncomplicated in ways that would have been impossible when we were younger. We both understood that our time together was precious because it was limited, but we didn't feel the need to rush toward major commitments or life-changing decisions. We enjoyed dinners together, walks on the beach, quiet evenings reading in the same room, overnight trips to explore other coastal towns. Carol had read both of my books and understood the journey that had brought me to California. She didn't try to convince me to reconcile with my family, didn't suggest that I was being too harsh or unforgiving. She simply accepted that I had made choices that worked for me, just as she had made choices that worked for her. "Family is supposed to be the people who love you unconditionally," she said during one of our conversations about our respective children. "But sometimes, the people who love you unconditionally turn out to be the people you choose rather than the people you're related to." On the 5th anniversary of my departure from Nebraska, I received a package from Sarah that contained something I hadn't expected, a photo album filled with pictures from family gatherings over the past 5 years. The photos showed Christmas mornings, birthday parties, graduations, and anniversary celebrations, all the events that had continued to happen in my absence. Sarah had included a note explaining that she had put the album together because she wanted me to see that the family was still gathering, still maintaining traditions, but that there was an obvious emptiness where I should have been. "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty," she wrote. "I just wanted you to see what we lost when we lost you." Looking through the album was both painful and validating. The photos showed a family that looked smaller and somehow diminished without the patriarch who had started their traditions and maintained their connections for so many years. Paul looked older and more tired in recent pictures, the stress of his heart attack and ongoing health concerns evident in his face. Michael had grown into a young man who resembled his father in troubling ways, his expression already showing signs of the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized Paul's approach to family relationships. But the photos also confirmed that life had continued without me, that the family had adapted to my absence, and found ways to maintain their connections to each other. They didn't need me to survive, just as I didn't need them to thrive. The final photo in the album was from the most recent family reunion, held just a few weeks earlier. The family was arranged in the same formation they had always used, with the adults in the back row and children in front. But now, there was an obvious gap in the center back row, a space that had clearly been left empty rather than filled by someone else. Sarah had written on the back of this photo, "We finally understand that some spaces can't be filled by other people. Some absences are permanent not because of anger or unforgiveness, but because some bridges, once burned, create distances that can't be crossed." Again, I appreciated her insight and her acceptance of the reality we were all living with. The family had learned to function without me, and I had learned to flourish without them. Neither situation was ideal, but both were preferable to the dysfunction and disrespect that had characterized our relationships before my departure. As I closed the photo album and set it aside, I realized that this would probably be the last communication I would have with anyone from Nebraska for a long time. Sarah's gesture felt like a completion, a final acknowledgement that our estrangement was permanent and that all parties had found ways to live with the consequences of choices that couldn't be undone. That evening, Carol and I walked along the beach as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. We talked about the photo album, about family relationships, about the ways that love and loss intertwine as we age. We talked about the children we had raised who had become strangers, about the grandchildren we barely knew, about the loneliness that had brought us together and the contentment we had found in each other's company. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Carol asked, echoing the question Helen had posed years earlier. I looked out at the ocean, where a few fishing boats were returning to harbor with the day's catch. The air smelled of salt and seaweed and the wild roses that grew along the cliff tops. In the distance, I could see the lights of the town beginning to twinkle as businesses closed for the day and families gathered for dinner. "No," I said, and I meant it completely. I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to choose myself over their expectations. I regret the years I spent making myself smaller to fit into spaces where I wasn't really wanted. But I don't regret leaving. And I don't regret the life I've built here. At 86 years old, I had learned that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to choose dignity over desperation. Never too late to surround yourself with people who see you as a blessing rather than a burden. The family photo that started this journey had taught me an important lesson. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who don't appreciate you is to remove yourself from their lives and give them the chance to realize what they've lost. Some stories don't end with reconciliation or forgiveness or dramatic revelations that change everything. Some stories end with quiet acceptance, with people learning to live with the consequences of their choices, with the understanding that love isn't always enough to bridge the gaps created by disrespect and neglect. My story ends with peace. Peace with my decision. Peace with my new life. Peace with the family I chose over the family I was born into. It ends with the knowledge that I spent the final chapters of my life being valued and appreciated rather than tolerated and managed. And if that makes me selfish or unforgiving or difficult, then I'm comfortable being all of those things. Because at 86 years old, I finally learned that my happiness matters just as much as anyone else's, and that sometimes the most radical act of self-love is simply walking away from people who make you feel, quote, invisible. The ocean continues to roll in and out outside my window, constant and eternal and indifferent to human drama. The whales continue to migrate along the coast, following patterns older than any family tradition. And I continue to wake up each morning grateful for the choice I made to leave a life where I was unwanted, for a life where I am cherished. That, in the end, is enough.